welcome to you for coming on to Kindred OT TV. And one of the first things I was going to ask you, because this is the very first time we've ever spoken, could you share a little bit about, just your OT journey and where you've been?
Yeah, of course. So my name is Aine O'D, and I went to the UK at 18, extremely young and enthusiastic about life because I had met a lady from Salford University when I was trying to figure out what to do once I'd finished secondary school. And she literally told me about OT, and I thought, that sounds like the best job ever. So off I went to the UK because it's terrible. I didn't want to stay in Ireland to study. I wanted to move away. I was from farming background and I wanted something different and exciting. So I went to the UK to study OT and was so fortunate with the course I studied. I had great tutors and mentors like Jennifer Creek and another guy who I know he lived in he was Australian, Surrey Shah. So just brilliant, like occupation focused education in undergraduate. And then I worked in the UK for a good number of years in lots of different roles, did some really nice mixed rotations as a basic grade and as a staff grade. And then the band system came in and I worked in, then I kind of moved into mental health. So I would have worked a lot in forensic mental health, community mental health, children and young people's mental health, and loved it, really loved it, because I think mental health for me was where I got that passion of like really working in an occupation focused manner. And then decided that I wanted to move back to Ireland a little bit hesitantly, but kind of felt, yeah, it was a good time of life to move back. So I moved back to Ireland. And even though I had a lot of experience, I didn't have much experience in pediatrics, but they were the only jobs that were available. So I moved into a pediatric team nearly 15 years ago now. Gosh, it's bad. Yeah, it's a long time ago anyway. And they were working in a transdisciplinary model and it was very new. And I came in and joined the team as a senior OT, but loved pediatrics. I worked in early intervention, so babies to 5-year-olds. I learned a load. I've always been a bit of a nerd. I love reading and I love reading occupational therapy stuff and just wider literature. So I read a load and upskilled in pediatrics. And then I went on then and did my master's because I needed a bit of a challenge and I wanted a bit of a change. And then when I did my master's, I was just like, oh, wow, there's so much I don't know. And my master's was much more around cognitive, like I really looked at like that cognitive profile. I did a couple of modules in neuroscience and looking at how it really links with an occupation focused perspective. So I loved my master's and then decided, actually, I think I want to carry on and do a PhD. But at that stage, had a baby, finished the master's. My baby was born just after, and then worked for another couple of years, had another child, and then started my PhD after my second maternity leave. So now I'm out the other side, nearly a year and a half, 2 years later from the PhD. And I work a lot now with other professionals. So I work with predominantly occupational therapists in clinical supervision or through clinical supervision. I provide lots of training and development courses on supervision, but other areas of OT practice as well, like executive functioning skills. And I work with managers and clinic directors and leaders around policy implementation. So yeah, so that's me over the last 2.5 decades.
And what did you do your PhD on?
So my PhD was actually in the area of, it was a PhD in population health and health service research. But I focused specifically on the clinical population of children and young people with motor coordination disorders, DCD, dyspraxia.
Wonderful.
So yeah,
And that's
no, it was good.
that's your which is how I came across you with social media, and had seen, yeah, just your, obviously your experience and your knowledge and probably passion for executive functioning and DCD and the more cognitive based things. So it's actually really interesting to speak with you today, because, or tonight for me, because so many of the therapists and mentors who I've had on have come from a more sensory integration base or those types of things. So I really want to talk after about, I guess, the how those things layer in, because there's obviously that interconnection between those things. But I will start with asking you, what is executive functioning and how is it important to the work that we are doing as occupational therapists?
So, executive functioning are all of those cognitive skills that we use on a daily basis. There's lots of definitions around it. There was a really nice paper published 2 years ago. Oh, this is terrible. You know, when you don't look at the name of a paper just before you come on a call and then you forget the authors, but it's a scoping review and it was published in the Australian Occupational Therapy Journal. So for anybody that wants to look back on it, I can send you on the details of the paper afterwards, Lee. And they looked at, it was Meyer, M-E-Y-E-R, Meyer et al., 2019. And they looked at the definitions of OT, and there was over 46 definitions that they found. So, but when you look at like what are the most common definitions, it is that piece of our cognitive functions that support everyday activities, okay? So they're the functions that support initiation, impulse control, planning, organization, problem solving, working memory, flexibility of thought. And different researchers like Barclay, who would probably be one of the most well-known from the 1970s, they will define it in a different way. But executive functionings are the cognitive skills that allow us to do things and to get it done and to stay on task and to keep our behaviours in line with what's required of us. So like, I know we're currently on a recorded call. I'm not going to start, getting up and just like fixing my jumper or something like that, because I know that, okay, other people will watch this. So my behavior is in line with what is required of me in this situation. So that's kind of like the overarching piece of it. And how does that fit with occupational therapists? So when you think about like whichever model of practice we work from OTs, we look at that piece around occupational performance skills, we look at occupational participation. And when you think about so many of our occupational performance skills and abilities will be influenced by our executive functioning skills, and it'll influence our occupational participation and our occupational engagement. Because if I struggle in any way with impulsivity or with initiation or with procrastination, that is going to impact how I start a task, how I start an activity, my capacity to stay motivated and to complete it and to finish it. So how I actually came to looking at a cognitive approach and cognitive approaches within OT was like, it's kind of like, I won't lie, it was when I started my master's, and back at that stage of my career, I was seconded to set up a primary care service that never had a service before. So there was a caseload of children and young people that had been on a waiting list for anywhere between 3 to 5 to 6 years. So they were maybe referred, like when they were anywhere from 6 upwards, to primary care, which would be, community-based services. They're not disability services. And they probably would have met the criteria back then around a diagnosis of DCD. But now they were like, I was seeing kids that were like 12 to 15, and it was all these like social emotional difficulties with everyday skills. And I went back to the literature to see, well, what are we supposed to do with children who have motor coordination difficulties or profile of DCD in like early adolescence? And there was so little there. So this has gone back to 2010. So that was what triggered me to do my master's, was to go, what am I supposed to do? I've been seconded in to set this project up in this service and audit it. And I was like, I don't know what I'm supposed to do. But it really brought home then that piece of, once I started looking at it, like actually these children were struggling so much with occupational performance and the impact on their emotional well-being. And it brought me kind of full circle background to looking at cognitive approaches to support occupational performance, inclusion and participation. So yeah.
So I guess it kind of impacts us, your people who are having challenges with executive functioning. It impacts us across those domains: school, home, emotional development. What are some of those common challenges that I guess we would see as therapists, or people would report to us, parents or educators? What are we seeing when there are those challenges there?
Yeah, the main bits that you'll see is difficulties with organisational skills in the school setting, being able to organise themselves and their belongings, time management, so being able to do their homework in a timely manner or take their books out of their bag in a timely manner, being able to independently organise themselves so that they don't have to rely on parents, teachers, educators, assistants to support their ability to organise efficiently and in a timely manner. Children who really get stuck with everyday problems. So from making a jigsaw and not being able to think, well, I could put it in here, to actually, well, my clothes aren't clean, so I'm not going to school today because I don't have another uniform or another thing to wear. So that piece around problem solving, which can be very linked to flexibility of thought as well, because if we can problem solve, then we can generate multiple solutions and it helps us to be more flexible in our thinking patterns. Everyday challenges with working memory. So, when parents says to you as an OT, they're always forgetting things, like they always come home without something. So that's real functional difficulties with working memory. They never finish things. I have to tell them what to do all the time. So that's the pieces with planning, problem solving, self-monitoring. Like when you think about the co-op, when you review that piece at the end, like the check, that piece of self-monitoring, they're kind of some of the everyday difficulties that parents, educators, therapists will point out.
And are there causes or known causes, or are there just I guess diagnoses that would then be more prevalent in? What's kind of the research around that, or what's the data around causes?
Yeah. So obviously executive functioning skills are brain skills and we all have them, and they mature from early infancy right up until our early 20s. So environmental opportunity is really important for the growth of these brain skills. So as occupational therapists, we really think of person, environment, occupations. So the occupations that like a young baby is exposed to, like their play of even those simple things of like tidy up in the early years, like encouraging them to, pull up their own pants and their trousers and to get dressed. So early engagement in activity supports all that brain skill use and development. And then there's key developmental periods we know from the neuro research around kind of like from 7 to 10, and then again in early adolescence, and then in like that kind of final piece in the early 20s. So it's a real developmental trajectory. It's not like we're born with this bank of skills and it's like that neuroplasticity is really, really important. But we know that also these executive function skills are really sensitive at different critical points. So some of the risk factors for executive functioning skills are being born prematurely or low birth weight. Okay. Also, we now know much of the newer research, the neuro research, imaging research that's looking at neurodiversity is showing that the executive regions are often key regions that are involved for children with neurodiversity. So by that we mean children who maybe are on the autistic spectrum, and children with motor coordination disorders like developmental coordination disorder, DCD, whereas previously we thought of executive functioning maybe as more the classic of being a core feature of attention deficit and hyperactivity. But we now know from those neuroimaging studies that actually the level of overlap between the executive regions, when you look at the profile studies on different diagnostic groups, that actually they're involved there. And we also know that for children maybe who experience early developmental trauma, or from, like, when I say early developmental trauma, like that lack of maybe also exposure to different environments to support the group of it, to support the development of these skills. So lots of different factors that can influence it, but also that neuroimaging information really teaches us as clinicians that we can have a really important role in influencing the environment and the occupations of children and young people, to scaffold it, to help to build on the personal factors and the skill development for young people.
Yeah, it's so broad, I guess. Like you say, it is kind of associated a lot with, like, I guess the kids who come to see me, majority have autism or ADHD or some kind of neurodiversity. So and we do see these executive functioning challenges in these kids so often. So you mentioned before about the emotional impact that some of these challenges have on kids, especially if they've gone such a long time struggling and with these challenges. Tell me a little bit about that, because it actually was one of my questions anyway, was to ask you about that interlink between, I guess, the physical, the cognitive, and the emotional, because obviously, executive functioning is a cognitive domain, I guess, but there are those that overflow into the emotional and the physical. So I'd love to hear you share on how that's all interconnected.
Absolutely. So, like, many school of thoughts will think about executive functioning skills too in terms of self-regulation. And you can look at self-regulation in terms of behavioral, physical, emotional regulation, and cognitive regulation. So even that, as OTs, gives us that sense. And sometimes maybe our lens might be more on the sensory physical regulation rather than the cognitive emotional. But actually it shows us that actually this is an overarching like piece here, that actually those brain skills really influence the emotional piece as well. Because when you think about it, right, my capacity to control my impulse, like the young 2-year-old will have a meltdown and they will lie on the floor fabulously and they will kick and scream and lash out. So we see that real emotional element and physical element of how they display their responses to a situation. So we see that real, like at that age, we just assume like joint physical emotion, because the cognitive piece there may not be supporting them well enough to be able to control some of those emotions. And also they may just be overstimulated sensory wise or emotionally. So they kind of go hand in hand, really, all three together. And they all support each other, because when you think about how the brain works, it's not these like simple silos. There's like communication across this diverse network, and they're all talking to each other at different times. Okay. What we see kind of like as the impact is the impact for children on their sense of self-efficacy, their sense of self-perceptions and their self-esteem is huge when they experience self-regulation difficulties. It's one of the biggest reasons why, if you go back and for that paper in the American Journal of OT by Abrams et al., and they looked at a systematic review of like effective occupation-based interventions, and self-regulation was one of the real ones that came out. And why? Because it really supports children to make friendships, to socially engage. Because if we can't, our perceptions of ourselves in our peer group, to actually be able to emotionally connect and relate, can really be impacted. So if executive functioning skills, yes, they're a cognitive skill, but they really, really influence the sensory and emotional piece. And it's like, to take them separately sometimes can narrow too much for the child, because actually the impact on their emotional well-being is just, it's huge. Because actually, if I struggle to problem solve, then that the piece that leads to greater anxiety. is that the piece that actually makes me feel more insecure in different social settings? If I struggle with time management, do I have a perception of myself that I'm always late and that people are always prompting me? So, yeah, I love doing courses on executive functioning so that you can actually really help people to look at like just how broad it is and the interlink between all three pieces. Because it's interesting when you said that on the podcast you've had more speakers who have had maybe their lens at whatever part of their career might be, that they're looking at a sensory perspective. And I would have definitely started that. I would have been there in the earlier part of my career working in pediatrics, and then it kind of evolved to much more of a holistic picture, I think, for me as a clinician anyway, looking at it. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's that interconnection between the three and knowing when to come in from whichever of those angles. And I guess my thought on that too is that often, and I'd love to hear your perspective, but often when we start to work on attachment and that perception of safety, or even some of the sensory integration pieces, executive functioning skills come on. So I'd love to hear your perspective on that as well.
Absolutely, because like when you start working on that, like for children who've experienced developmental trauma or attachment difficulties, you can't go in with the cognitive piece that we might go in as an approach, would say maybe for a child with DCD, of like problem solving and planning what they're going to do and how they'll do the task and setting the goal, because that's a cognitive approach that's very effective for that child. But for a child who's maybe experienced trauma or attachment, we might start at the sensory and emotional regulation piece of like real like rapport, engagement, safety, trust. So we're creating this environment that actually allows their cognitive skills to flourish. Because what happens when I'm not emotionally safe or sensory, my whole sensory system is being triggered by the environment, that if I'm in overwhelm, that's not when you can problem solve and generate solutions and plan. Our cognitive like lays or window or gate, whatever kind of like metaphor we want to use, that will narrow and narrow the more we're putting on, like if there's too much happening emotionally or sensory. It's like, think about when you're driving a car in really busy, heavy traffic. What's the first thing you do? You turn off the radio, you stop chatting and laughing with the person in the driver's seat, because it's taking all of our conscious. So when you feel that sense of like safety, security, trust, that gives this lovely environment to see their executive functioning skills flourish, because now I can explore the toys in the room. Now I can explore and engage in a creative activity, or I can try things. And once I start engaging and trying, I'm planning and I'm problem solving, and I have to control my impulse, because if I pour too quickly, whereas we don't do any of that risk taking and that engagement behavior when we don't feel safe and trust the people in the space, or we don't have good solid relationships. So yeah, I completely agree. We have to attend to like that core, like if you think of that regulation triangle, we have to nearly take like a Maslow's hierarchy of need and actually look at like emotional, sensory and physical regulation before we can go up to the top piece of cognitive at times.
Yeah, I just was just wondering if, I guess, as a non-researcher myself, I guess I'm just talking anecdotally, or, just, I guess, the things that I see. And so often, my experience is that when we, I guess, work on, or not even work on, but start there, we naturally see some of those other issues resolve, or at least make progress around. So, so interesting. And when I'm hearing you talk a lot about the environment as being just in most of our conversations so far. I feel as though that's probably a really big piece, or a really big consideration for assessment and treatment. But I'd love to hear about, I guess, what your main considerations are for assessment and treatment, and how you would approach. What do you consider? What are your main considerations for those things?
do you know, like, if I was to leave the researcher aside for a minute, I think clinician wise, ever before I knew about executive functioning skills, I think it would have been the environment. Because when you think about executive functioning skills, the environment will promote or it will inhibit and be a complete barrier. So if you're meeting children that maybe will say, like, have experienced trauma, maybe the family environment at home is chaotic and it needs a lot of support. Often the environment is the first place that we're starting, because we're not brain surgeons, we're OTs. And we know that by making simple changes in the environment will allow people to engage more effectively. So if we make simple environmental changes, like making the routine a little bit more obvious, the structure of an activity more obvious, we now provide this scaffold for somebody of, like, where do I start? What will I do first? And what will I do in the middle? And how will I know when I'm finished? Because for those children that, like, they just don't even want to start the activity because maybe their motivation is low, but also it feels so overwhelming for them. So as OTs, we'll often be that place when we'll do a school visit. We might talk to the teacher about, like, okay, well, what about a visual schedule or a checklist to support them? And for me as an OT, that's not a communication skill. That's real looking at executive functioning skills of, like, actually what's supporting this child to know what they have to do and how to get it done, how to engage with it. The other ways around the environment is that, like, structured environments that are, we will reduce the challenge, the stimuli in them. We might look at, like, how are they being overloaded? Are they being supported from a sensory perspective by the environment, or is it a real barrier to them? So for me, environment is nearly the first fix, because that's the piece that we can kind of see maybe most immediate change with. And then in with the environment, I think the activities, the occupations just map together. It's about looking at the occupation, like, when parents say they won't start their homework or they won't get dressed, or he starts getting dressed, but he just doesn't finish getting dressed. And then it's like, and it's about that real analysis of the activity to say, actually, where is the breakdown occurring? Those lovely core skills we were taught in our undergrad, like around activity analysis. So that piece around the analysis of the activity, because then that's going to tell us, well, where are we going to start? What's the most important executive functioning skill here? Is it the planning piece? Is it the piece around staying on task and on focused? Is it around attention? Is it working memory, that I forget what I was doing and I don't know how to get back on track? So for me, I think being occupation focused in your assessment is probably the most important thing to do, because these are cognitive skills and we want to target the cognitive skill through a functional activity versus just going at the cognitive skills targeting the person and taking a deficit approach. We can take a strengths-based approach by doing that. There's lots of different standardized assessments out there that you can use, but I honestly don't think there's any as good as our non-standardized qualitative assessment of the actual occupation and the environment, because then you can really individualize it and customize it to the need of the customer, be that a 5-year-old or a 20-year-old. But some of the standardized assessments that are out there are, you could use the BRIEF, which is the Behavior Rating Inventory of Executive Functioning Skills, and that's a nice performance skills questionnaire, and you can use that with parents or educators, or if it's an adolescent, they can complete it with themselves. And it's lovely because it catches information around occupational performance, so you can see it in everyday activities. So that's quite a nice one. Then there's other tools that we can use, like the cooking assessment, which is a really nice one, or the AMPS, or the BADS. So there's lots of standardized assessments out there that we can use that can help to inform our practice. But I think it's not to just solely rely on the standardized ones, that actually the qualitative ones. And it's really interesting. I'm going to shut up in a second because I feel like I'm doing all the talking, but
I'm enjoying it.
There's one other piece which I am just fascinated by at the moment, is that when you look across interdisciplinary research, psychologists and neuropsychology are talking about the importance of ecological assessment. And in the last 5 to 10 years, it's this really big thing about ecological assessment. And like, it makes me smile because I'm like, OTs have been doing ecological assessment since the day the profession was founded. And maybe we didn't name it as that. And I know like many researchers like Kiel Hoffner really introduced this concept to OT. But it's like we need to own our ecological assessment, because there's tools being designed now in other areas such as neuropsychology that are what they're considering ecological assessment. Like there is there was one that examined like, packing your own lunchbox and, looking at like how many distractions the children experienced whilst engaging in the activity. And it's a tool that they were designing and developing. And I'm like, OTs have been doing this for years. We never wrote it down. And we never said that you could make this into a standardized assessment. So it's like, it's nearly to take that lens of that we can put a standardized assessment on anything. That's why making a cup of tea is one of the most complex activities that we'll ever do. All of the motor, cognitive process skills that are involved. So just look at the things that you do in a school-based assessment or a school obs, and you will see how many executive function skills you've noticed. So yeah, don't feel like you have to go out and do, I know I do training on executive functioning skills, but don't feel like you have to go out and like learn all of these new standardized assessments. You know this stuff. This is your core practice.
It's actually interesting saying that about other disciplines kind of, I guess, coining the things we've been practicing for a long time. It reminds me of Tracy Stackhouse when I went on Camp Jabiru and I attended as a practicum, and Tracy was and Beth Austin were the I guess the practicum mentors for the practicum piece. And Tracy said back then that one of the reasons why she really wants that clinical reasoning and the right terminology and for OTs to essentially own their practice is to have integrity and to stand up as a profession. And it stuck with me. So when you were saying that, it just took me straight back to hearing that all those years ago. And so true, because it's not just coining some of these, ecological assessment, but even sensory concepts are coming up in other disciplines as a new thing almost. And like you said, it's things that's been practiced, right back at the very beginning. So it just reminded me of how important it is to truly understand our role and know it and own it and celebrate it,
Yes,
share it.
absolutely. And it was one of the things that like I learned so well on the PhD, and I never would have thought about it, but like, so there's a lot of newer research that's coming out now, like talking about complex intervention and the MRC framework. And there's been so much, research gone into that of describing it. But as occupational therapists, we need to be able to define and describe our practice, because it's a complex intervention. There's multiple components, and the outcomes will be for multiple different stakeholders, like for parent and school, different people, different outcomes, okay? And it really taught me, because when I did my PhD, like there was only 9 of us on it, and it was a national program. So most of my colleagues were either epidemiologists, pharmacists, or medics. And they could describe their interventions no problem, because they would be talking about maybe pharmaceutical components and different things. And in the early days of the PhD, I was like, And then I went back to the literature, and this is so well versed in the literature. They talk about it, the black box of intervention. But there is amazing research now come out. You might be familiar with the Australian research, Sarah Reedman, and she's working a lot, like in completing research with children with CP. But one of her studies, she used what they call the tidier. So it's a template that actually helps us to describe and define our intervention. And it's really simple, it's headings. But I do think you're right. It's like we need to be able to describe it so we can have fidelity to it, but also we can show the intervention components. I used a cognitive component in conjunction with a sensory perspective, in conjunction with a motor piece, so that we could target the goal of A, B, and C in order to achieve the outcome of D. And I think as OTs, if we can become more comfortable with using that professional language that is occupation focused, it'll really help to advance our practice.
I agree, and I think that's where Tracy was coming from, was not only being able to articulate it, but actually knowing the what to do and when, and be really, really founded in the clinical reasoning. And that was, I guess, I think that
Absolutely,
actually
absolutely.
was clinical reasoning.
Yeah, because if we can't describe our intervention, what am I doing? What's the what? Like what? And so what?
Yeah.
Like what? So what outcomes do you expect? What is your hypothesis? Like, so like Tracy's so right. We have to be able to clinically reason and describe our interventions really clearly, so that we know what we're doing when we're questioned on it. It's like, well, the reason why engaging in this occupation is really important for the child is that actually it enhanced, self-efficacy, self-esteem, engagement in a school, etc. We see improvements across A, B, and C. So yeah,
And you
you
mentioned,
can.
sorry,
Yeah.
go
No,
ahead.
no, not at all. You can hear the passion in me that starts to come out. I'm like, come on, we are the best. We can do this.
And were pioneered by people who have had little access to the research we have now, and the knowledge, the imaging on, brain mapping. There was none of that, and who pioneered this in absence of all of that. So, yeah, I guess it's kind of.
That's it. Like when you read some of Mary Law's and Sylvia Rogers' Eardley research, like, I mean, it was unbelievable. Elizabeth Carson, Anne Beckett, all those Eardley founders of, like, in their ear, like, they knew it worked, but now we're in an era where we can articulate it, and it's expected of us to be able to articulate our clinical reason.
Yeah, it's so. I'm with you. You get so passionate and can go down a rabbit hole with this. I'm sure. But you did talk about that you are teaching around executive functioning on courses. Have you got a course available at the moment, or are you still working on it? I did see that. I still had to flick through, and I saw that you were planning on it. So where are you up to with your course?
Oh, Lee, I'm the worst. I'm the worst ever, because I have amazing intentions that I'm going to have everything online. And I have a course coming up on, I've ran a course previously on intervention, so occupation focused practice and occupation performance for children and young people with executive functioning skill difficulties. And now I've got one that's coming up at the end of June so I'm sure Australian OTs can book onto it as well. It's through the Association of Occupational Therapists in Ireland, and it's looking at assessments to support occupation focused practice for children with executive functioning difficulties. So it's going to be all about assessment. I had planned that I would have that recorded and available online by the time I spoke to you, Lee. But I won't lie, that hasn't happened yet. I'm really good to coach others. And then my weeks get a bit too busy, and I haven't scheduled that time for like development. But in the next year, that's what I really would like. I would love to have more courses available to occupational therapists internationally that give us that neuroscience evidence, that give us that research evidence on the studies of, like, well, what does this show? But then how do we apply that in practice? Because that's the area that I love. I love clinical practice and being able to. So that is the plan, is that there will be courses available on my website on executive functioning skills. There's one there at the moment for teachers, but I just need to convert that and tweak it and change it so that it's more suitable for clinicians as well. So yeah.
Wonderful. Well, I will look forward to it, and you can let me know when it's there, and I'll share it.
Thank you kindly.
One final question. What if there's people wanting to learn more or check out some resources, what do you recommend, or who do you recommend in the executive functioning world, that would be websites or books. What do you love that we could be looking at?
Oh gosh, what do I love? If this feels like absolute self-promotion now, right? Okay, and I don't mean it in that way, because it is quite a low class resource. I run an online journal club as well. And if anybody's interested in signing up to it, you'll have all the previous journal clubs with it, okay? But we ran one journal club on executive functioning. So there's the recorded meeting on all the discussions about it, but then there's loads of, so it's as a whole module. So in that module, then there's all the pieces around like assessment tools, good research articles and guidance. So some of the bits, what would I use the most? Like, you cannot beat Peg Dawson and Greer. So if you want a free, easily accessible checklist on it, their free checklist is great and you can use it, and it looks at like strengths and weaknesses across the different executive regions. I would really encourage clinicians to go back, because I'm nearly sure it's open access, and look at the scoping review on the use of executive functions in occupation-based practice. That's a new publication, and it'll give OTs a really good sense of how we should be defining and describing executive functioning in occupational therapy practice for children and young people. So that's a real key article that I would say. So you have your assessment there, you have a good article. This is absolutely terrible, Lee. I can see the booklets in front of me that I go back to. And you know when somebody asks you and you just pull a total blank of what you go back to? So I'm going to email you some of those resources that you can share on the channel, as the people can describe that they're freely accessible, because if I go looking on my computer now, it won't be good. But there's some really, really nice booklets. A podcast that I love to listen to, because I suppose much of the early research on executive functioning was for children, young people and adults with ADHD, is the Adult ADHD podcast. It's a UK based one, but the two gentlemen that present that podcast, they have lots of different episodes on executive functioning. And I love the style of how they present the podcast. So they present it across 3 segments, which is like they'll look at the neuro of it, current evidence, and top tips that they find that work. So that's just a nice one if you want like executive functioning kind of taken out of the research and brought back into the everyday piece. So yeah.
Well, they're fantastic recommendations. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Oh, that's great. I won't keep you any longer. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing and all your insights. And I can see how passionate you are about it. So I'm so grateful. Thank you so much.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you. Thank you kindly.
Done. I'll be the first to know. You can let me know.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. Thank you, Lee. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Not at all.